The wind went still in a way that never felt natural, like the desert itself was listening. Every small sound echoed too loud inside my helmet. The smell of oil and cold metal clung to my gloves as I leaned over the workbench, breaking down a rifle that was not even logged to my name. Behind me, boots shifted on gravel, slow and deliberate. No one said a word. They rarely did when they thought you were just the armorer. I kept my head down, breathing steady, listening to the radio breathe static instead of orders. Beyond the wire, the land lay flat and empty, heat wavering off the sand, but I felt watched. Not imagined, real. The kind of attention you never notice until it is already on you. Someone behind me let out a short laugh and asked if I even knew how to dial for that kind of distance. I did not look back. I closed the bolt, wiped my hands clean, and lifted my eyes to the ridgeline where the air shimmered like it was holding something back. Some moments do not rush you. They wait, quietly, patiently, until you decide who you are going to be. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I was deployed in the year 2013, working out of a small forward operating base tucked into the high desert near Dry Creek, Nevada. It was the kind of place that did not show up in headlines or deployment briefings for families back home. No flags on the gate, no ceremonies. Just dust, concrete barriers, and long days that blended together. I was a sergeant in the United States Army, officially assigned as an armorer attached to a joint task unit running extended long-range evaluation drills. On paper, my job was simple: maintain weapons, log serial numbers, fix what broke, hand rifles back clean and ready, then disappear. Most days, my world stayed small. A metal workbench scarred with old scratches, trays lined with springs and pins, the steady smell of solvent that never fully washed out of your hands, no matter how hard you scrubbed. I learned early that if you did your job quietly and did it well, people stopped noticing you were there at all. That was expected. Support stayed in the background. Logistics stayed invisible. Safe work, some of them called it. The kind of role people assumed fit a woman better. The team running the exercise was a Special Forces detachment rotating through desert conditions before an overseas deployment. They were disciplined in a way that did not need to announce itself. Short sentences. Minimal movement, no wasted energy. They trusted their own and kept their circle tight. I respected that. I also knew I was not part of it. I handed them weapons and took them back. That was the line. Friendly enough, but distant. They did not ask questions about me, and I did not offer answers. What none of them knew was that the armory was not where my story with rifles began. Before the Army ever handed me a toolkit, before rank insignia meant anything, I had grown up shooting in a small town outside Millstone, Wyoming. Not recreational shooting. Competitive long-range shooting, early mornings. Cold fingers, wind calls that could make or break an entire day. My father taught me patience before he taught me speed. He used to say distance punished arrogance faster than anything else. By the time I enlisted, reading terrain and trusting a trigger pull felt as natural as breathing. But that part of my life never made it into my service record. I never corrected it. The Army has a way of assigning you a box, and sometimes it is easier to stay inside it. The week leading up to that day was different. You could feel it before anyone said it out loud. The exercise parameters kept changing. Targets were pushed farther back. Time windows tightened. Simulated intel feeds shifted without warning. Wind patterns turned unpredictable, rolling through the valley in uneven waves that made spotting unreliable. Instructors walked the line more often, watching, listening, pressing just a little harder each day. They wanted to see where the breaking point was. I saw it first in the weapons. Rifles came back hotter than expected. Optics needed more frequent adjustments. Bolts showed wear patterns that told me shooters were forcing shots instead of waiting for them. I fixed what I could, recalibrated, cleaned, re-zeroed, and sent them back out without comment. That was not my lane, or at least it was not supposed to be. At night, lying in my bunk, I replayed the days in my head, the missed shots, the frustration and voices that tried to stay calm, the quiet arguments between spotters who knew something was not lining up. Distance has a way of humbling even the best shooters, and the desert does not forgive confidence without preparation. The margin for error was shrinking, and everyone knew it. No one wanted to be the first to say it might be too much. I stayed where I always stayed, on the edge, listening, watching, doing my job well enough that no one questioned it, but not well enough to draw attention. That was the balance. Yet something inside me kept tightening with each passing hour. A familiar pressure I had felt years earlier, lying prone behind a rifle while the wind teased the bullet path, just enough to punish hesitation. By the time the final evaluation day arrived, the air felt heavy despite the open sky. Nothing had gone wrong yet, and that somehow made it worse. The kind of quiet that does not mean calm. The kind that means something is waiting. I did not know then that the line between armorer and shooter was about to disappear. I only knew that the skills I had buried were about to matter again, whether anyone expected them to or not. By the third day of the exercise, something in the rhythm was wrong. Not broken, not loud, just off enough that you felt it before you could explain it. Radio stayed open longer than usual, the static stretching out while people waited for replies that came a second too late. Spotters leaned closer to their glass, murmuring numbers that did not line up, then falling silent instead of arguing it out. The desert was doing what it always does when it wants to remind you who is in control. Heat shimmer bent the horizon, pulling targets closer, then pushing them farther away until depth felt unreliable and distance turned dishonest. I saw it first in the weapons. Rifles came back coated in fine grit that worked its way into places it should not have reached yet. Barrels held heat longer than they should have. Optics were just slightly off, not enough to blame the equipment, but enough to punish a clean shot at range. I adjusted, cleaned, re-zeroed, and logged everything without drawing attention. That was my role. Fix the symptoms. Do not comment on the cause. Each time a rifle left my bench, I felt the same quiet tension I used to feel before a competition shot. Not excitement, awareness. The kind that settles low in your chest when variables start stacking up and no one wants to acknowledge them. Shooters came back frustrated but controlled, forcing calm into their movements. That kind of control only lasts so long before it cracks. Late that afternoon, while I was wiping down a bulk carrier, I heard Captain Ryan Ellison talking with one of the instructors just outside the armory tent. He kept his voice low, but not low enough. He was asking about the final evaluation shot, the one everyone had been circling without naming. The distance had been extended again, farther than planned. Farther than what most people attempted outside a perfectly controlled range. I heard him ask if it was still within reason. The instructor did not answer right away. Silence can say more than a refusal. No one wanted to be the one to say it was too far. Not out loud. Not in front of the team. Pride was part of it, but so was pressure. These drills were about capability, about proving readiness before deployment. Pulling back now would feel like failure, even if it was the smarter call. I had seen that dynamic before. Once you let momentum build, stopping it takes more courage than pushing forward. That familiar tightening settled into my chest, the one that used to show up right before a difficult shot. Not fear. Responsibility. The awareness that small miscalculations turn into large consequences when distance stretches out. I wanted to say something about wind patterns, about barrel heat, about how the mirage was lying more than usual, but I also knew my place in the hierarchy. I was the armorer, support, the one who stayed in the background and kept things running. In the Army, timing matters as much as truth. Speak too early and you get dismissed. Speak too late and it does not matter anymore. I weighed the moment and chose silence, not because I believed nothing was wrong, but because I knew how quickly a voice like mine could be ignored. Sometimes you wait. Sometimes you watch. Sometimes you let the situation reveal what it needs to reveal on its own. As the sun dropped lower, stretching long shadows across the range, the air grew heavier. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter disappeared. Everyone could feel the approach of something decisive, even if no one named it. Rifles were checked again. Databooks filled with notes that looked confident on paper but felt uncertain in practice. I finished my work, washed the grit from my hands, and stood just outside the armory, watching the horizon ripple and shift. Nothing had failed yet. That was the problem. When things fail quietly, people adjust. When they almost fail, people push harder. And when they do not fail at all, even when they should, that is, when the danger creeps in unnoticed, I stayed quiet, listening to the radios, watching the wind flags twitch in uneven patterns, knowing that the distance ahead was no longer just a number. It was a question, and no one had answered it yet. The weather turned without warning, the way it often does in the desert, fast and indifferent. One moment the air felt manageable. The next it was alive with crosswinds that cut through the valley at uneven angles, twisting and changing before you could fully read them. Dust lifted in thin sheets, then settled again, never long enough to trust. The instructors called a brief pause, heads together, eyes on the flags and the distant ridge. For a few minutes, everything stopped. Then the order came down to continue. When the target was moved, I felt it before I heard anyone say it. Farther than planned, not by a dramatic margin, but enough to matter. A steel silhouette was reset against the terrain, its edges blurring into the background until it barely separated from the rock and shadow behind it. At that distance, visibility itself becomes a variable. Arguments faded. No one debated the call out loud. Orders have a way of ending conversations, even the necessary ones. The shooters rotated through their positions, methodical and controlled, each one doing exactly what training had taught them to do. Thrown, breathe, dial, wait, fire. Each shot broke clean, followed by a long, empty silence. Then, another miss. Close enough to feel promising, far enough to sting. Over and over, the same pattern repeated. Distance stripped away confidence without making a spectacle of it. It does not need to. It just waits. Frustration crept in quietly. You could see it in the way hands tightened on stocks, in how spotters adjusted their glass one more time than necessary. Doubt followed close behind, slipping into the gaps where certainty used to live. No one raised their voice. No one lost discipline, but something was wearing down, layer by layer. I stayed near the armory, close enough to observe without inserting myself. Too close, maybe. I felt eyes on me again, the same looks I had felt earlier. The armorer lingering, watching, listening. People notice when you pay attention beyond what is expected of you. I could read the wind patterns moving across the valley, see how they split and rejoined in ways that would bend around just enough to miss. I knew what adjustments I would make. I also knew no one was asking. One of the operators muttered the word impossible under his breath, not in anger, just as an observation. Another answered him immediately, sharp and controlled, saying that word was not in their vocabulary. The exchange was brief, almost casual, but the word stayed. It hung in the air heavier than the dust, heavier than the silence between shots. Impossible is a dangerous word. Believe it and you stop trying. Challenge it without understanding, and you start breaking things that cannot be fixed. I had learned that long before the army ever put stripes on my chest. Distance does not care about your confidence. Wind does not respect determination. They respond to patience, to humility, to knowing when to act and when to wait. Another shot broke. Another long pause. Another near miss. The steel stayed silent. The instructors exchanged looks that said more than their clipped commands. Time stretched, the afternoon dragging on while the sun burned lower and the wind refused to settle into anything readable. No one wanted to call it. Not yet. Not after coming this far. I felt that pressure return, heavier now. The pull between what I knew and what I was expected to do. The unspoken rule that support stays silent unless spoken to. The understanding that stepping out of your role can carry consequences, even when you are right. I watched the shooters cycle again, watched the data books fill with notes that would not solve the real problem. The desert did not change. It did not offer relief or clarity. It just kept moving, slow and patient, daring someone to misunderstand it. I stood there, hands at my sides, listening to the wind work its way through the valley, knowing that the situation was no longer about skill alone. It was about judgment. And judgment, once tested, rarely gives you a second chance. Captain Ellison looked my way after another miss echoed back thin and empty across the valley. It was not a confident look, and it was not challenging. It was tired. The kind of look you give when options have narrowed and pride has nowhere left to stand. He asked, almost lightly, whether I thought the rifle was even capable of making that shot. The way he said it told me he was really asking if anything on that range still was. I did not hesitate. I told him the rifle would do exactly what it was built to do, as long as the person behind it did their part. He nodded once, then asked who that person was supposed to be. I answered before the weight of the moment could catch me. I said I could take the shot. For a second, no one reacted. Then a few of them laughed. Not mean laughter, not mocking. The kind that slips out when tension needs somewhere to go. Someone shook their head. Someone else muttered that this was getting ridiculous. I stood where I was, hands still, eyes forward, feeling my pulse settle instead of spike. I had expected doubt. I had lived with it long enough to recognize its sound. The laughter faded on its own. Silence took its place, heavier than before. This was not awkward silence. It was decision silence. The kind that presses in while everyone waits to see what the person in charge will do next. Captain Ellison studied me, really looked this time. Not at my rank, not at my assignment, at my posture, my calm. The way I was not trying to sell myself. He did not ask about my background. He did not ask why an armorer thought she belonged behind a rifle meant for extreme distance. He simply nodded once and told the line to reset. Not because he suddenly trusted me, but because he had run out of reasons not to try. When the rifle was placed in my hands, it felt like something that had been missing had finally been returned. The weight settled naturally, familiar, balanced. I checked the optic, adjusted the bipod, and dropped prone without rushing. The ground was warm beneath my chest, the kind of warmth you feel through layers, steady and grounding. Around me, the range went quiet. Conversation stopped. Radio stayed open, but unused. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if curious. The spotter assigned to me lay down beside me, stiff at first, uncertain. I asked him to call the wind honestly, not optimistically. He hesitated, then agreed. That was enough. Trust does not need ceremony. It just needs clarity. I studied the mirage through the scope, not the target. Heat waves told me more than steel ever could. The wind was still inconsistent, but it had a rhythm now, brief windows where it lined up just enough to be read. I adjusted slowly, deliberately, making small corrections that would look insignificant to anyone watching. Distance does not reward drama. It rewards restraint. Behind me, I could feel the shift. Not belief. Attention. That was fine. Belief comes later, if it comes at all. I focused on my breathing, letting it fall into the cadence I had learned years earlier on cold Wyoming mornings, lying in the dirt with frost on my sleeves and my father watching silently behind me. Inhale. Exhale. Pause. Let the sight picture settle instead of forcing it. The spotter whispered his call. I waited through one cycle, then another. The wind teased the edge of the valley and moved on. I waited again. Patience is not passive, it is active restraint. Finally, the air aligned just enough to feel right, not perfect. Right? I exhaled and let the trigger break under steady pressure. No jerk, no rush. The rifle recoiled cleanly, straight back, exactly as it should. I stayed on the scope, tracking the shot, not lifting my head. At that distance, outcomes take time. The silence that followed was long enough to stretch nerves thin. Then the sound came back to us, delayed but unmistakable. Steel ringing once, sharp and clear, cutting through the wind like a statement. No one spoke at first. The spotter let out a breath he had been holding without realizing it. I stayed prone for another moment, letting the adrenaline settle before it could turn into something sloppy. When I finally rolled onto my side, Captain Ellison was watching me with a different expression than before. Not awe, not apology, not apology. Understanding. I handed the rifle back the way I had received it, steady and clean. My hands were calm. My chest felt light. I had not proven anything extraordinary. I had simply done what I knew how to do when the moment asked for it. Sometimes that is all it takes to change the direction of a day. Sometimes that is enough. The moment I settled into the dirt, everything else fell away. Not disappeared, just stripped down to what mattered. The stock pressed into my shoulder, the earth firm beneath my elbows. The steady rise and fall of my chest. The world became narrow in the best way, reduced to breathing, trigger pressure, and the faint shimmer of steel so far away it barely looked real. Distance does that. It turns certainty into suggestion and demands that you earn every inch. The spotter lay beside me, his body stiff, his voice low and careful as he called the wind. He was unsure, and I could hear it in the way his words hesitated before leaving his mouth. That was all right. Uncertainty is honest. I listened, but I did not rely on the numbers alone. Math gives you a starting point. Instinct tells you when the numbers are lying. The mirage moved in uneven bands, bending left, then right, teasing just enough to pull a round off course if you trusted it blindly. Time stretched thin. Seconds felt long and weighty, like they had mass. No one behind us moved. No boots shifted. No radios whispered. I could feel the attention at my back without turning my head. Every eye was there, every expectation, every doubt. Ahead of me was emptiness, a vast, open distance that did not care who was watching. It only cared about physics and patience. I waited through one full breathing cycle, then another. The wind toyed with the valley, lifting dust, dropping it again. I adjusted a fraction, barely visible movement, the kind you make when you know big changes will only make things worse. The trigger rested under my finger, familiar and responsive, a tool that does not argue if you treat it with respect. At that distance, sound behaves differently. You learn that early or you learn it the hard way. The shot leaves you before the outcome arrives. Consequences lag behind decisions, giving you just enough time to wonder if you were right. That space between cause and effect is where doubt lives, and you have to deny it entry before it takes hold. I let my breath fall naturally, not forcing the exhale, not rushing it. The sight picture settled, the shimmer aligning in a way that felt balanced rather than perfect. Perfect is rare, balanced is workable. I increased pressure on the trigger slowly, steadily, until the break surprised me just enough to be clean. The rifle recoiled gently, straight back into my shoulder, controlled and honest. It felt less like a kick and more like agreement, as if the machine understood the choice that had just been made. I stayed in position, eyes on the scope, tracking the invisible arc of the round across a distance too great to fully comprehend. Silence followed, long and deliberate. The kind that stretches nerves thin and tests resolve. In that silence, I felt calm. Not excitement, not fear. Just a quiet certainty that whatever happened next would make sense, even if it hurt. When the sound finally came back to us, delayed and clear, it cut through the stillness with a single sharp ring. Steel answering steel. Proof traveling slower than doubt. The spotter sucked in a breath beside me, his body finally relaxing. I did not move right away. I stayed prone, letting the moment pass through me instead of clinging to it. At that range, you do not celebrate. You acknowledge. You absorb. You understand what it cost and what it might change. I rolled onto my side only after the echoes faded, my heart steady, my hands still. Behind me, the range exhaled all at once, sound and movement returning cautiously, like no one wanted to scare the moment away. I knew then that the hardest part was not the shot itself. It was carrying the weight of it afterward. Decisions at distance have long shadows. They follow you long after the sound fades. The impact reached us long after the trigger break, carried on the air like a message that had taken the long way home. A single, unmistakable ring rolled back across the desert, thin at first, then solid enough to feel in your chest. Steel answering steel. No one reacted right away. There was no cheering, no raised voices, no release of tension the way you might expect. The sound seemed to press everything even quieter, as if the range itself was taking a moment to understand what had just happened. That ring was not about success. Not really. It was about possibility. It was about the quiet understanding that something everyone had dismissed as unlikely, even unreasonable, had just been proven otherwise. Assumptions had been laid out on the table and overturned without argument. Distance had been respected instead of challenged blindly, and it had responded in kind. The instructors were the first to move. Clipboards came up, radios clicked back to life. One of them called the drill complete, in a voice that stayed deliberately neutral, as if emotion would contaminate the result. The order carried weight. It marked the end of the evaluation, but it also marked a shift that did not need to be documented. The team stood where they were, some still behind their rifles, others slowly rising from prone positions. No one rushed toward me. No one slapped my shoulder or made a joke to break the tension. They just stood there, processing. You could see it in the way their posture changed, how attention replaced skepticism without ceremony. This was not a victory lap. It was recalibration. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the ground through my uniform, listening to the wind settle into something calmer now that it had nothing left to prove. Inside, I felt no surge of pride. No rush. Just a steady calm, the kind that comes when something aligns the way it is supposed to. The shot had not elevated me. It had clarified something that had already been there. When I finally stood, movements returned around me, cautious at first. Captain Ellison met my eyes from a distance. He did not smile. He nodded once. It was enough. Respect in that environment does not come wrapped in praise. It comes in acknowledgement, quiet and durable. The instructors began packing up, talking in low voices about data and conditions, already translating the moment into lessons. The team followed their lead, returning rifles, resetting equipment, moving on with the discipline that had brought them there in the first place. But something had changed. I could feel it in the questions that were not asked, in the glances that lingered a second longer than before. Respect does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives without words, settling into the space between people like dust after a long drive. You do not hear it land. You just notice that the air feels different once it does. I walked back toward the armory, the rifle no longer in my hands, the moment already beginning to recede into memory. The desert stretched out the same as it always had, indifferent and vast. Nothing about the landscape had changed. The steel target still stood where it always had, but assumptions had shifted, and that mattered more than any mark on a range card. I knew then that what stayed with people would not be the distance or the number attached to it. It would be the reminder that roles are thinner than we think. that capability does not always announce itself, and that sometimes the quietest person on the line is carrying the longest reach. There was no celebration to return to, no story to exaggerate, just a shared understanding that would travel with us long after the exercise ended. In the Army, that kind of understanding is rare, and when it comes, it does not need applause. It simply takes its place and waits to be remembered when it matters again. The hours that followed felt different, even though the routine stayed the same. Rifles still came back to the armory. Logs still needed to be signed. The sun still sank low and painted the desert in dull orange light. But the way people looked at me had shifted. No one said it out loud, but I could feel it in the pauses before they spoke, in the way questions were asked instead of assumptions made. I was not just the armorer anymore. I was someone they wanted to understand. They asked about wind calls, about how I had waited through the shifts instead of forcing the shot. They asked where I learned to read mirage like that. I answered simply, without embellishment, years on a range back home. Trial and error. Patients learned the hard way. No one laughed this time. They listened, really listened, as if each detail might matter later. That kind of attention carries its own weight. When the range finally went quiet and the team dispersed, I stayed behind. The rifle came back to my bench and I broke it down again, slower than usual. There was no rush now. Each part came apart cleanly, familiar under my hands. I wiped down the barrel, checked the action, and set everything in its place with care. The metal was still warm, not from the shot itself, but from the day it had carried. I felt the weight of what it represented settle in as I worked. It was not a record, not something that would end up in a report or a briefing slide. No one would pin anything to my chest for it, and that was fine. The value of that moment had never been about recognition. It was proof. Proof that the lines people draw between roles are thinner than they think. Proof that capability does not always come labeled or announced. As I cleaned, my thoughts kept drifting back to all the times I had stayed quiet because it was easier. Easier to fit the expectation. Easier to avoid friction. Easier to let people underestimate you than to challenge the picture they already had in their heads. I thought about how many skills get buried that way, not just in the Army, but everywhere. How many people carry more than anyone ever bothers to ask about. That day followed me long after the exercise ended, not as a highlight, but as a reference point. When later assignments tested patience or judgment, I remembered the silence before the shot. When doubt crept in, I remembered the delayed ring and what it meant. When someone dismissed a quiet voice, I paid closer attention. In the weeks that followed, small things changed. I was asked for input during equipment checks. Spotters included me in discussions without prompting. Nothing formal, nothing written down, just a subtle shift in how my presence was understood. Respect, once earned, does not need to be defended. It simply exists. Eventually, the unit rotated out. The desert returned to its empty stillness. I packed up the armory the same way I always had, logged the same numbers, followed the same procedures. But I carried something new with me when I left that place. Not confidence, but clarity. The understanding that staying silent is sometimes necessary, but it should never be permanent. I did not leave the armory behind. That remained my role. But I no longer saw it as a limit. It was just a position, a place to stand until the moment asked for more. And sometimes, when the moment does ask, the only thing that matters is whether you are ready to answer. That day taught me that readiness is not always visible. It does not always wear the right patch or carry the right title. Sometimes it is working quietly at a bench, waiting for the distance to demand honesty. Years have passed since that day in the desert, but it still finds me when the world goes quiet, not the shot itself, not the sound of steel ringing back across open ground. It is the seconds before it that return without warning. The stillness, the choice. The moment when staying invisible would have been easier and safer, and stepping forward carried consequences I could not fully measure at the time. I did not change the Army that day. I did not rewrite training doctrine or shift how units operate. No manuals were updated because of me. But I learned something lasting about weight and distance, about how far doubt can travel when it is left unchallenged, and how far responsibility reaches once you decide to carry it. Distance magnifies everything. Skill, mistakes, decisions. It does not care who you are supposed to be. Some shots are not about hitting steel. They are about standing in a place you were never expected to occupy and accepting whatever comes next without excuses. They are about understanding that silence can protect you, but it can also limit you, depending on how long you choose to live inside it. What stayed with me was not the echo or the attention that followed. It was the calm that came afterward, and the clarity of knowing who I was when it mattered. The desert faded. The exercise ended. Life moved on. But that silence, and the person I became inside it, never really left. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.